interpretation than the media looking for something positive without offering us anything definitive. In terms of Israel, Hezbollah, Hamas, you have to ask yourself this set of questions. Are the concepts of victory, and as we talked about, what really constitutes victory? We hear words tossed out, two-state solution. Tom and I were talking a little bit about that earlier. And it just emphasizes to us that there's a certain, and I'm not saying this critically of us because we're all subject to it, there's a certain simplicity of ideas like the two-state solution, which underscores something that I wrote about in Substack at one particular time. And that is, what is a two-state solution? How does that really flesh out in detail? And it's very different from what anyone is willing to talk about in the public arena. Now, maybe there are discussions like this going on behind closed doors. And we'll never know that until the histories are written 50 years from now. But I don't see anyone, for example, other than the Israelis, talking about what victory will be. And even then, there's there's a lot of wiggle room. But from our side, from the United States side, I don't see anything that is concrete enough to make any of these five elements seem to make sense. So again, just when you go through the news and listen to it, keep something like this in mind. See where it all is leading us. Yes.
Yeah, the five concepts of victory. Whose concepts are those?
Well, these were drawn from an article in the Naval Proceedings magazine, and they're based in part on that particular author's perspective on these different kinds of issues and how
Was he
they
talking
played
about
out.
World War II or?
Well, the next slide actually does that a little bit. Let me go here. Give you just some examples of where they apply and how eventually you force some kind of political solution. Because remember, all military conflicts, even unconditional surrender, eventually involve a political solution. Now, Tom, are you recording? Because it's 10 o'clock. Okay, just wanted to be sure we were there. And that's part of why I find the historical perspective interesting. To me, there are ways that we can look back with considerable amount of information which we lack today, because those pieces of information are hidden from us, as they may need to be at this time. Yet at the same time, we're committed as a nation to particular actions, whether it's directly or indirectly for each of us through paying taxes, or the person for whom we're going to vote come November, or the person for whom we voted in the past. All of these things tie together, and they can't be ignored in terms of what's important. So today, new developments in the world, and it's getting to be intriguing. Now, I've talked a great deal about these conferences, and I'm going to go through certain things just as a very quick reminder, because these particular conferences represent looking forward to the end of the fighting. And that brings us back again today. What is the end of the fighting going to look like in Ukraine and the Russian Federation? What is the end of the fighting going to look like with Israel and Gaza and now southern Lebanon, and indirectly with Iran, and the hotbed that remains in Syria, and the issues that are still going on in Iraq and Afghanistan? Is there linkage among all of these, or only part of them? Is one weak, very weak, another one very strong? Here's what the British and the Americans, and at different times the Russians or the Soviets were going to do. And I talked about these at some length before. Bretton Woods, Okay, market control, right? Think about that. What's going to happen in Ukraine and Russia when that war ends, as far as the global economy is concerned? And where do we, as the United States, deriving very little resource from either Ukraine or Russia, going to be committed to do, which may have little to do with sustaining our own economy or protecting our own national interests? Whatever the conclusion is in Israel with Hezbollah and Hamas, how does that affect our economy? What do we get from any of those places that is of vital interest to us? Those are questions which have to be established and dealt with. In terms of the Dumbarton Works, this is the international organization. And I call this the Kumbaya approach that was tried after World War I. And if you look among the different elements that are involved here, one of the things that is constantly talked about is international peace. Okay, let's think about that for a minute, because this is going to be a critical issue as we come to reviewing the history that we're going to get into shortly. But I bring this up because we ask ourselves, yeah, international peace, what does that mean? What's world peace? It means that the borders around nations basically are inflexible. Because if they're not inflexible, if you have borders that are contested, then you're going to have conflict by its very nature. So the idea that a static political set of boundaries in the world is frankly nothing that history supports throughout our entire history of human beings. Okay, so the idea that we can achieve world peace means the borders remain fixed, or if there's a contest, all right, and you want to find a peaceful resolution to it, how do you impose that resolution? You have to have an element of force.
Hi, Mary.
Sorry?
Fine, let me just turn this sound off here. If I can find the thing. Where is it? Oh, somewhere.
Okay, we hear you. So when they say peaceful means, we all think, oh, great, peace. No, nobody gets killed. You know, we don't have to build up military and all the rest of it. Is that realistic? If an international organization is created, does it have the authority and the power to enforce a decision? In the history of the League of Nations, there was never any enforcement. In the history of the United Nations, there was only one time, and that was Korea. Okay, so we keep that in mind. And yet conflicts have been ongoing forever. So this hasn't fixed anything. This was a little more specific in what was going to happen to Germany and what was going to happen to Japan at the end of the conflict. So demilitarization of Germany. Now, what does Putin want out of Ukraine? He wants to demilitarize it. He has said that. That's one of his aims. Is that practical? If you demilitarize a country, what does that mean?
You own it.
You got it. Right. You want it, you got it, like the song. Okay. And that we're willing to drop the bomb. Notice when this decision is made, right? So this is the kind of thing that we look at in 1944, where they're already saying, as we talked about last time, we're not sure the bomb is going to work, but if it does
We
work.
didn't have one at that point.
Right, so we're presuming that if it's available, we're going to use it.
Trusted physicists.
Right. And then we have this conference, which I talked about. The scribbling on the left is Churchill's writing about the division of interests. Do we see anything like this reaching the public arena? Only in the last several months, has there been any talk about the ending of the conflict in Ukraine by Ukraine losing the territories that have been occupied by the Russian Federation at this point? It's just beginning to hit the public area because Zelensky has said, I want all of the occupied territory, including Crimea, returned to Ukraine. And Russia has said, screw that idea. We basically want to control all of Ukraine. Neither is realistic from my perspective. But the point is that now other countries, and I've written about this in Substack for months, that there's going to have to be a territorial shift. And that's a question of how much, not if. Yes.
I would argue that in the eyes of Russia, this is just a return to the way things were and therefore ought to be, trying to reconstruct the old Soviet Union.
Not only that, but Putin's own history that he described at length, and it's a fascinating read. And he reviewed it with Tucker Carlson when he gave that so-called interview. It was really more a platform for Putin to talk. Talked about the history going all the way back to Kiev as being the capital of the Russian people, the Rus, and so on, and then the eventual shifts that occurred in St. Petersburg and then finally Moscow. So it's an interesting example, as Robert has just pointed out, that these, we'll call it, according to Desmond Morris's book, Territorial Imperative, that the territory you occupy may not be sufficient to solve all your needs, whether those are economic or physical or psychological, and you want more territory. And how you're going to go about getting it. So that kind of sets the stage through 44 of letting us know what the dynamics are that are leading to a view of the end of the war and how that is going to flesh out in terms of reality, of real politics. Now, this is a quick review of certain things going on. All right, come on, Robert, tell me what's funny.
Stranded whale.
Yes.
Anzio. It is.
I talked about the last series, the invasion of Sicily, and then the invasion of Italy, both across the boot, which Montgomery was responsible for, landing at Messina, and then also on the heel, and beginning the drive up the eastern side of Italy, and the landing by the Americans with some British at Salerno, and being caught there for the first few days in a desperate fight to maintain their foothold, but eventually breaking through and heading north and getting up to what was called the Winter Line. The classic term there is the Monte Cassino line. That's not entirely correct. It was called the Winter Line. And the idea was that the Germans under Kesselring at that time had established this enormously powerful defensive line across the width of Italy at this point, terrible terrain for the attacker, and stymied the advance any further. Naples had fallen, but we were not anywhere near where we had expected to be as 43 closed up. Now, what happened then, as you can see here, in January 22nd of 1944, the Americans decide they'll use their Navy and amphibious capability to land near Rome at a place called Anzio. And when they land there, the intent was to press inland quickly, cut the supply lines that were sustaining the Germans at the Winter Line, and force them into retreat, if not actually trap them. Unfortunately, there were insufficient resources that were brought in at Anzio. And Truscott, who was in charge of that particular amphibious assault, was faced with a very important decision that he alone could make. And that was how far inland to advance. His decision was not to advance as far as the Alban Hills, which might have led to cutting the main north-south road along which the Germans were receiving supplies. There were other roads, but that was the key one. Why did he decide that? Because the perimeter that he would have to defend in his mind would have been too weak. And if the Germans mounted much of a counterattack, he might well lose the whole ballgame. Now, that's what prompted Churchill's comment, because they were stuck at Anzio for several months. Does that mean Truscott was wrong in doing what he did? Or does it underscore that Truscott was right because it took 3 months before they built up enough support in order to break out of Anzio? One of those questions historians like to debate. And if you're into gaming at all, it's also a fun game to play to see if you can break through the Alban Hills and then not get destroyed in the counterattacks that take place. Eventually, however, think about this now, from January to May, 5 months, you have no progress on the Italian peninsula. No. That's like World War I again.
Mhm.
If you're able to drive across a short distance of no man's land, pretty soon a counterattack drives you back. And the reading of the histories and the experiences and the misery of being in wintertime
Mhm.
where vehicles can't really help you. In fact, they had to shift to either manpower to bring supplies to the front lines, or they began to use a lot of donkeys, because they'll carry the stuff and they're a little more sure-footed. The fighting was intense, very, very difficult, but eventually there was enough power built up in both Anzio and across the winter line that eventually, under something called Operation Diadem, 2 offensive moves could be launched. And the one from Anzio was initially designed to accomplish what it was supposed to accomplish in January, to get across that main supply line and trap the German forces that were down at the winter line. Similarly, there was to be a drive through the winter line, eventually breaking it so the 2 forces could link up. If they trapped a bunch of Germans, great, all well and good. But in the meantime, there would be such disarray that the Germans might fall back well into northern Italy. Mark Clark, who was in charge of the Americans at this time, decided, because we're now getting into June, and he knows that Normandy is in the mix. He doesn't know the exact day, but he knows that's coming. Wanted to take Rome. And part of the reason was political. Remember, Italy had already surrendered, all right? So it wasn't an issue of taking the enemy's capital and now they surrendered. They'd already surrendered. Taking Rome was a morale boost. Look what we finally accomplished through all of this slogging after months and months. We've taken the city of Rome. And that had to strike a big chord in everyone's heart at the time. As it turns out, he captured it 2 days before the Normandy landing, and the Normandy landing, of course, hit the front pages of every newspaper and was on the front page for ages. So despite taking Rome and looking for all of the glamour that would come along with that, it very quickly was shunted off the front pages. What happened at this point was that because the Normandy invasion was going on and there was another operation planned for southern France called Operation Dragoon, the idea was now the Italian theater would fall into a 2nd/3rd place. Resources would be siphoned off from it. Any amphibious capability had to be shifted either for Dragoon or brought all the way back to England for Overlord. And units were rotated out that had combat experience so they could be rebuilt and used in the critical theater that was to become northern France. So everything slowed down on the Italian peninsula. What about from the German side? As we'll see when we cover these issues in the next set of lectures, the Eastern Front was in deep trouble as far as Germany was concerned. The Soviets were making great advances, but Hitler realized, at least from his perspective, that if the Allies, the British and the Americans, were successful in landing in France and gaining a serious foothold, that the end for Germany was going to be imminent unless something extraordinary took place. And that leads to the creation of his so-called miracle weapons and his references to the Frederick the Great in the 7 Years' War. I won't bother you with that right now. The rest of the Italian campaign, again, was a slogging match for the most part. Again, the terrain was absolutely awful for an attacker. So as the Allies were eventually moving upward, they never completely were able to take Italy. Now, just a very quick recap. Yes, Robert?
How many German divisions were pinned down in Italy by virtue of this advance, and therefore could not go to either the Eastern or the French Normandy front?
I don't have an exact number, but it was on the order of, I think, 15 divisions, which is a substantial number, except these divisions were not at full strength. So they relied heavily upon the terrain to compensate for the lack of numbers. In addition, the German Air Force had really been almost non-existent in Italy. It had a very, very modest presence because of the shift of fighters in particular back to the homeland to defend against the strategic bombing. So from that standpoint, there was not much. And it was also pretty clear that the Italian terrain was not very suitable for large concentrations of armor. So even though you might have some armored vehicles there, in terms of what we call armored divisions, the Germans called them Panzer divisions or Panzer Grenadier divisions, those were shifted back either to the Eastern Front or to, as we'll see, to Normandy, to hold back the British in particular and the Americans. This slide is just designed to demonstrate what had happened in the early to mid part of 1944, and to highlight that, interestingly, Rommel wanted to defend further in the north. He wasn't in favor of defending south or on the potential landing beaches. A completely different approach to what he wanted to do in France, where he's wanted his armored groups and everybody very close to the beaches so they could defeat the Allies at the waterline. And it was Kesselring's rationale to stay further south and use the terrain effectively as he did. And Hitler had to make a choice between the two approaches, and he chose Kesselring's approach. This just shows, and the reason for this is not to have you look at any of the details. Why don't you look at the color? This is Anzio. Truscott, and I hope I can do this without totally screwing everything up, was supposed to get across this hill line, the Alban Hills here, these hills, and here's the main route. This is where the winter line is, okay? Truscott was supposed to get all the way to here. But look at the size of the perimeter if he had gotten there. He could be stretched pretty thin. And as he would move into this difficult terrain, and these different colorations are listed down here in terms of what the elevation is, but obviously white is sort of sea level, and then you go to higher and higher elevations as you get to the darker colors. The point is that he's moving across an open plain area and even a few defenders on the high ground, given the distances involved, can really impact the attackers. And Truscott was aware of all this. So from his perspective, even though he was given the instructions to advance to here, he felt he didn't have the resources. And being hunkered down here, remember, they land in January. It takes until May for him to break out. So again, a close run thing, but eventually when they do break out with Operation Diadem, and you'll see these little blue arrows here, Clark goes up to Rome. They advance up the Leary Valley. They've broken the German defense line. And now the Germans have to scamper to try to get out of here. Because as you can see from this difficult terrain, and if you've traveled in central Italy at all, you know that the roads there are not easy. So again, an example of where things went. So they chase, that term is maybe overutilized, they chase the Germans back north and diminish supplies and reinforcements. All right, here's Anzio, Rome, and they finally are driving up through several months of difficult terrain. Oh, this little guy over here. Anybody know about Elba?
It was a resting place.
Yes, it was a resting place for Napoleon, right? On his last stay was there. They eventually take Florence. They're able to drive up towards the coastal cities at Rimini here, and get up to Livorno here, Pisa. But by the end of 1944, they're still short of the Po Valley. Now, if you have a terrain map, you'll see that just about at this point, the mountains basically end and you begin to get into more of the plains, where if you had an armored force, you might be able to move more rapidly. But remember, all of the time they've struggled up Italy, there's no real point to vehicles, to armor. You have some, but it's really not going to be anything of great prominence. So in this particular situation, the eventual effect is that Italy is relegated to a secondary or tertiary theater of engagement. The forces are there to try to pin down Germans, and there are about as many Americans, well, actually more Americans and Brits than there were Germans. But it had a purpose, it served a purpose. And in the other part of this is that as they move north, they can establish airfields here, which are much closer to hitting German resources in Romania, Bulgaria, and even into southern and eastern Germany. So it's helpful from that regard. Any questions on this? Because basically when we get to 1945, there isn't much to say about Italy.
Where'd you get the map from?
Let me think for a minute. It's one of the books I have.
One of 2 or 3.
But as you can see, it's written in German.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen.
No, but
Okay. Any other questions about the Italian theater?
So the air superiority that the Allies had during this phase of the war didn't seem to really amount to a whole lot, is that right?
Yes, in this terrain. And
So
if
they
you-
were that heavily dug in?
Oh, yes, and because of the nature of the terrain, it's not just that you're dug in, it's that you have to think about how can your aircraft get onto that target? And how do you avoid flying into a mountain in bad weather, things of this sort, because the weather was atrocious through the winter time as well. And planes were grounded for days, not being able to accomplish anything. The place where you could continue to use your air power would have been more strategically. Because the bombers can get up high, and remember, despite our idea that the bomb site we had was that accurate, it was still area bombing. You know, you hoped you got within a mile or two of your target with your bomb load. Okay, now we're going to shift to another theater we've talked about before. And again, a neglected theater of the war in nearly all the histories that you'll run across. But there's some very interesting elements that take place here. And it becomes, I'll call a secondary theater as opposed to a tertiary theater of war, which it had been almost from the beginning of the Japanese conflict in 41. Through 41 and 42, the Japanese ran roughshod over this area and drove the, we'll call it the British forces out. Another word for that would be the Commonwealth forces. We tend to think British as people from England, but a lot of these troops were not from England. There were some, but a lot were from Australia, India, and even Africa. So I'll show you in a bit. And the Japanese had basically run roughshod over everybody well into the Burma theater. And there seemed to be little prospect for the British, who were in charge of this area, to make any headway at all. So 1942, 1943, just nothing much happening. They were hanging on was really the basic way to think about it. 1944, things begin to change. Now the supplies have been built up, the manpower has been built up. The Japanese have suffered considerable naval losses, which has limited their flexibility, which they had used to great advantage in 42, particularly in the Indian Ocean. But now they've suffered enormously, and they're beginning to get rocked back on their heels a bit. Now an opportunity exists to try to recover these areas. Why do they even matter? But why bother? It's not as though, at least on the surface, that the Japanese can invade and take India away. That seems to be a pipe dream. Their navy isn't powerful enough, so even if they encroach on India, they have terrible supply lines. They're spread out around a perimeter. What's the point?
2 points. Support China. And the Japanese were trying to foment revolution in India against the Brits.
Right,
Keep them out.
right. Interestingly, Mahatma Gandhi was very much in favor. He wasn't neutral. He was very much in favor of getting the British out. And a fellow named Bose, B-O-S-E, developed what he called the National Indian Army, which was allied with the Japanese. And on top of it, I said this way back in earlier lectures, that is that Burma was the rice basket for Japan. Enormous amounts of rice that could be taken and brought in. Burma didn't have oil, that was further south, all right? So that was a different issue, but food was still important. And then, as Greg mentioned, what about China? There are over 1 million Japanese soldiers in China. How are the Chinese being supplied? They're being supplied by the US and the British, who are taking things in to China. Initially, they were doing it through the Burma Road, but that was cut off in 41. So it really basically fell to another 42. It basically fell to no use at all. So there was no overland route. So we were flying things in. Okay. In addition, the Chinese had under Stilwell entered into this region of northeast Burma and were confronting the Japanese advances there in order to try to open the supply routes so more supplies could flow into China. And the more supplies in China, the more you could damage the Japanese. And then there was another little thing entering up. The B-29 at this point, while still only relatively few in numbers, because the Pacific was too far away. Anything we had in the Pacific was too far away for the B-29 to reach, but not in China. So we developed air bases in China to support the B-29, and the B-29 could strike Japan. But it takes a great deal of material to keep those air bases functioning. So if you cut the supplies, they become much less functional, much less dangerous to you. So the Japanese had reason to think that continuing on and holding these areas and maybe even pressing forward will be in their best interest. From the standpoint of the Allies, it's just the reverse. So we're talking about that here. Now, the North Burma campaign is a complicated one, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail there, but the important part of this is that the Allies now are developing an offensive strategy, which was designed to drive the Japanese back. One of the first initiatives was actually down at the Arakan area, which is not shown here just yet. And it's right at the very top, the coastal operation, where the British were going to try to drive down the coast. It had more favorable terrain and so on and so forth. And that turned out to be a mini disaster. Nearly 2 Indian divisions were surrounded by the Japanese, and fortunately, they were able to get out. Now, just as a recap, this purple area shows you the extent of Japanese holdings in Burma. And I'm going to break this down into some other slides here, but I want you to get a perspective where India is, and then look at the terrain. You know what Nepal is like, you know what Bhutan is like. They're very, very mountainous regions, very difficult terrain to work in. But this gives you a perspective on what things looked like up until 1944. This is a blow up of part of that, and it just is to show the Lido Road and the Burma Road, and that the Japanese have cut any particular potential connection between the two. The Lido Road was being constructed initially to link up to the Burma Road, which had been cut in 42. But to get there, you had to have the right terrain to follow, and you had to get to this place called Michina, which is where the red arrow is, in order to establish a strong enough foothold to push the Japanese back so you could complete the connection to the Burma Road. The blue line that you see above is the hump and how supplies were being pushed in. This was, again, a blow up of part of that slide, and it shows the air transports. And the reason for showing you this, I'm going to go back a second. Let me just make sure I hit the right button. Is to show you that in this upper left corner, you see the Brahmaputra there. And you don't get any idea of the terrain by looking at this, but the idea is that this is mountainous area around Lido, going down to Dimapur, Lunding, and so on. Impala is another important mountainous ridgeline area, serves as a barrier to those where those bases are. So as you look at this, these bases were responsible for bringing the supplies in over the hump. And once the road was opened, as you see up in the upper right corner, you see where Lido is, and you begin to see the connections that are going to lead to the road that I showed you earlier. The Japanese are looking at this saying, what can we do about these? Is there a way for us to wreck them? So the Japanese were thinking about this as well. Now, again, this is a general view. It's to give you an idea of the terrain that you're looking at. Enormously difficult terrain with a few open areas such as, let's see if I can do this. which is relatively flat, right? Following the course of rivers, which head down this area, but you've got enormously difficult mountain terrain to deal with here. This is a blow up of this, just showing the concentration that's building up in North Burma on the Indian border. And what is going on at this point is that both sides are thinking offensively. Nobody right now is on the defense. The Allies have been on the defense for several years, but now they are really thinking about how to be offensive. And I mentioned about this particular first attack that took place along the coast that nearly got this British contingent destroyed. You'll see up here, and we'll talk a little bit about these in a little more detail. You'll see that Stilwell is here, and you'll see that this whole army group is here in order to contest this region, which the Japanese are going to try to break. And Slim is here with his particular army. And you may have heard his name. It'll crop up again. As we look in more detail to the Arakan area, this is the offensive that failed. And the reason, again, as I've said before, is that while the British drove down here hoping they could establish real footholds all the way down the coast and make supplies come in by sea, because the Japanese Navy isn't the threat it used to be. But instead, the Japanese counterattack and nearly cut off these two Indian divisions. These Indian divisions, of course, are under the Commonwealth, and they were supplied by air and allowed them to eventually break out from this threat. The Japanese, as I said, were thinking offensively. They had two major goals they wanted to accomplish that I've already talked about. They wanted to keep the Lido Road and the Burma Road not being usable. And now they also want to drive back the British and Allies from the air bases. The area with the Lido Road and the Burma Road are basically under Stilwell. This is the North Chinese Army Corps that's listed up here. Oh, I don't know why it does it that way. It's very strange. Okay, almost there. There we go. And what you'll see here is that Stilwell with Chinese troops, right? There are no real Americans here other than a few officers. And so much as there's trouble with the Chinese army, under proper leadership and organization and with a modicum of supply, they can actually do pretty well. And as a result, Stilwell begins to launch his attack down this more open terrain, hoping eventually to get to Michina down here, and then they'll be able to drive further south, and there's the Burma Road down here in the lower right corner. So eventually that's the way they want to go, but they've got to go over this very difficult terrain and fight their way down a narrow valley as they go. He uses these long-range groups, the Chindits we talked about last time. Merrill's Marauders was an American group. And what they do is they land behind the enemy lines. They try to disrupt air bases and supply nodes, and then they have to be rescued at some point, or they've got to abandon where they are. And the stories that go along with all of that are fascinating in themselves. So notice here, though, October 43, they're building up. March 44, March, April, May. It takes a long time to travel this distance. And a good reason for that isn't just Japanese resistance, it's because the terrain is just so god-awful. Who participates? This is not something that most of us are aware of. East African troops? Really? Okay.
But I see one Sikh
Yes.
and one British officer. 2 seats.
There's one there, there's another one there,
Mhm.
there's the British officer. Okay. But these guys are there, they're doing the grunt work. As we get towards the middle of 44, despite Stilwell making his advances that he is making in the northeastern part of Burma, the Japanese have now built up enough of their supplies from their perspective that they want to conduct an offensive, and this is called Operation Yugo. All right, that's Japanese Yugo, not Yugo Igo. Although Ichigo is close, isn't it? Okay, sorry about that. They knew the logistical situation they faced was very difficult, and there had been considerable discussion in the Japanese high command about whether or not an attack was even feasible or sustainable, because once you got to this area, your supply lines were really very, very long. And remember, the Japanese Navy was not as powerful, so we couldn't use the Japanese Navy to make bringing your supplies by ship and landing them at different ports along the coast would be suitable or sustainable. So this became a critical issue. Nonetheless, because of the problems they faced, they thought they could do this. And they launched a major attack, Operation Yugo, in order to get across that mountain range that I showed you and get back to where the transport bases were and the main logistical supply nodes. You had a question?
Was that why the rail line that crossed the River Kwai
It was part of the
built?
system, all part of the system.
To resupply that particular army group?
Yes, but that wasn't the only rail line, but that was one of the keys and one of the issues that you
The
brought
only
up.
one that I saw.
Yeah, the movie, The Bridge on the River Kwai is an interesting example of that. And there is actually a River Kwai and there's actually a bridge area
And
there.
we have crossed it,
You did?
and we have seen Hellfire Pass,
Oh, my goodness.
which was 40 feet of sheer rock that the Allied cruisers were forced to cut through with rock hammers.
Mhm. An example that the Japanese were not supposed to ask officers to work, but they did. So, Mutaguchi is the person who's put in charge of this particular operation. He was a very experienced general. And the interesting part is that back in 42, he really didn't see any advantage to try pushing north in Burma beyond where the Japanese were in 42. But now that he's put in charge of this, it's not just a yes, sir, tell me what to do or how high to jump. It's a matter of saying, no, I think we can really do this. And they didn't have any expectation they were going to conquer India. You know, a lot of that was a fear in 42 when the Japanese were advancing seemingly without much resistance. But it was never really feasible from any strategic level. The best that the Japanese were hoping for was to cut India out as a resource, not conquer it. Yes.
It seems to me that they were optimistic in some way because at one point in my existence, I had notes, rupee notes that were printed by the Japanese for their use when they got into India.
Yes, that's right. And they had some particular emphasis with that, with Gandhi wanting to undermine British authority and Bose bringing an Indian army up. But Bose's army was relatively small. If there hadn't been a major internal revolt in India, then it just wasn't going to happen. India is just too big. And you had to control the sea if you were going to supply anything there. The other part of this, of course, was that many Indian units had been used in Africa, in North Africa. And now they were also being shifted to be used to defend this particular perimeter. Once the sea was no longer Japanese controlled, as it was through 42, once it was no longer controlled, the idea that India would fall to the Japanese was in a sense, wishful thinking. Now, the Japanese would undermine morale as much as they could, as any country will want to do. And when you have certain politically important dynamic leaders, such as Mahatma Gandhi, you want to foster that as much as you can. But I think the idea of any reality, I've not seen where Japanese have said, we're going to take India. I think it was more render it neutral, get it out of support for the British. But that's, again, history's open to interpretation. We can read the same history and come up differently. Now, we have certain concepts of jungle warfare, and we usually think of great big trees and vines and undergrowth and, you know, tigers and lions and bears, oh my, you know, that kind of thing. This is a lot of jungle. It's relatively open areas, but with very high grass and swampy terrain. This is very much an impediment. And the reason I show this is to ask yourself, if you're this guy and this guy, whom you can barely see, how far apart do you think they are? And how far can he see? I'm always impressed with these pictures because I'm thinking this guy has a Bren gun down here. What can he see? Nothing. So in terms of dealing with terrain and the kinds of issues that just were throughout this area of Burma, you have these open areas that would look open from the sky, not covered with trees, but you can't see 10 feet. And you've got to advance through that? I don't think I'd like to be that guy. Somebody waiting for me. And if somebody had high ground, and I'm just going to point this tree out here, but it's obviously not important. But if there was a big tree back here, and a guy is up there with a set of binoculars, looking down into that, he can see you coming. So he's hidden. He may have some mortars, he may have some machine guns, because he knows that he can sweep an area and he can start lobbing shells into you, and you can't see him. You have no idea where he is.
Not only can they be seen visibly, but you can be heard.
Right.
Well, you've got, what, 40, 50 pounds of equipment,
Right.
you know, per infantryman. And a lot of that's jingling around and you're stepping, breaking branches and
Exactly.
just all kinds of noise. You know, of course, that noise factor increases with the size of your unit.
Right.
So it isn't just sight, it's also hearing.
Right.
And have you any idea how many leeches there are in that terrain?
You have a good point there. You do indeed. Although leeches are more frightening than painful because they just are on you. I mean, they're, you know, we consider them very gross, but actually they use an anesthetic in order to get into the skin and suck the blood out. There was a great cartoon, by the way, of mosquitoes doing that. And this one mosquito has jabbed his proboscis into a small artery and he's blowing up, and the other mosquito saying, pull out, pull out. Anyway, it's all good. So the offensive moves, with that Operation Hugo, they're going to drive through this terrain. We only had the British picture there, but it gives you an idea of the kind of stuff you're going to run into. Now, Stilwell, as I showed you on an earlier slide, from January through April, I showed it mostly from March, but he was accumulating his resources, beginning to drive south. And he's successful. He's pushing the Japanese back with Chinese forces. This is almost unheard of in terms of the Japanese experience. And that tells you something about what the Japanese were experiencing and how this was translating into morale and into their views of, am I going to get home again? Kind of thing. So what it shows you is that the Japanese basically had to almost run for their lives at different times in order to get out of Dodge here and down here, or they were going to be destroyed because there's no way out. There's no way out. You can't you just can't walk out of here. Now, Stilwell did in 42. They literally walked 100 miles plus to get away from the Japanese, but they ended up with practically nothing by the time they got back to a place where they were relatively safe. Success of the Chinese forces, this just goes to show you, if you get the right leader with the right attitude and training and competence, you can accomplish things that otherwise you'd think would not be possible.
Michael,
Yes,
did the Chinese leader come from the nationalist side
yes,
to the communist side?
nationalists. And Stilwell was directly under Chiang. He had no connection to Mao. Now, Chiang, on the other hand, had to deal with Mao's forces. But the communist Chinese forces were remarkably efficient. There seemed to be a little less infighting. Now, maybe that was because of Mao himself as a charismatic leader, and maybe because he was willing to get rid of anybody who was an opponent. But he also rewarded merit. Chiang was still dealing with a lot of the warlord issues that he had to deal with through the 1920s and 30s in order to just be able to control a good part of China. But that meant co-opting what were then warlords into his support, and that meant giving them the proper support, both financially, not just materially, and things of this sort. So he was dealing with a troublesome issue. Now, in terms of the Japanese area that I had talked about previously, I just showed this slide because I emphasize the points that the Japanese are going to attack right up through, get over this mountain ridge line if they can get over it, and get into this area, destroy these bases, get to the Brahmaputra. Beyond that, nothing. I saw no indication that the Japanese were planning to go any further than that. And frankly, it would have been logistically impossible for them. And if they took many losses en route, given all the obligations elsewhere, there were going to be very limited reinforcements. So this was, in effect, we'll take some terrain, we'll do as much damage as we can, but we're not sure we can even stay here. So is this just a big raid, or is this something more? They had some confidence having beaten back the British, but they're beginning to see a collapse on their right flank. Now, I'm going to hit these two places because the thrust, and it's in the histories, is the Japanese move onto that ridge line that's before you descend to the Brahmaputra and where those air bases and supply nodes are. You run into a very difficult set of terrain features, and they're centered around this place called Imphal, which is actually the Manipur kingdom, as you see here, and another space much smaller further to the north called Kohima. I bring this out because the fighting in this region was very intense, very brutal in its own way. And as I'll show you in a little bit, it was also literally very close combat. This isn't just a matter of shooting over 300 or 400 or 500 yards at your opponent or bombing them with artillery. This is also a matter of literally being faced. This shows you just the organization. It shows you roughly the strength. The problem with looking at strength is that a British division was not the same as a Japanese division, and so on and so forth. But you notice there's just one tank regiment on the Japanese side, and I'm sorry, on the Japanese side, and one armored brigade on the Allied side, because there just wasn't much place to use armor. They were, basically sort of mobile strong points at best, where you could move around, shoot at something, take machine gun fire and survive, and then move somewhere else. terrain was basically awful. Gives you an idea of the casualties. Now, this is actually a very important element here. I know the numbers look very, very specific. I always worry about the numbers when I see them. But as a good estimate of what's going on, I think it's very helpful to see the disproportion. But many of the Japanese who died actually died of starvation when they were retreating back. So if you think about this, the number you bring to the fight and the number who were killed and wounded, were either left on the battlefield or eventually you might get them back to some kind of rescue station and even get home. The problem is you're a long way from home. So a lot of them die during the course of a retreat because they can't be cared for. And your logistical collapse is enormous. Scraggy Hill at Imphal. This is a very good example of the kind of devastation that takes place in this area. This battlefield to me looks like World War I. I mean, there's just nothing there. And right here, you'll see a dugout. So you might hide in there, depending on what shell fire is coming your way. Maybe you store ammunition in there, maybe some food. But you'll see that this terrain is just beaten down to practically nothing. The 17th Division was responsible initially for holding the Japanese back. In spite of everything that's going on, in spite of this being 1944, the Japanese still are able to move forward, get there before the Allies find them and react properly. The 17th Indian Division just holds them off until reinforcements are able to arrive. And just further north at Kohima, where you have many fewer people involved, but notice the infantry division on the right there is Japanese. That's a gross estimate of 15 to 20,000. And if you actually look at the number of frontline soldiers, the guys actually the tip of the spear, it's a much, much smaller number. A lot of those people are logistical support, communications, medical support, things of this sort. And it looks as though the Allies are terribly outnumbered, but they flood in reinforcements, as you can see. And you look at the deaths, just casualties and losses, combat deaths only. So you have one Japanese division that might lose 50% of its people, most of whom are going to be your frontline troops. So that means your logistical support, the people in the rear, less well-trained, less well-capable. And now you got to get out of there. You've got to go all the way from that location all the way back to some place of safety. And where is that going to be? I show this because here's another little dugout, if you will, down here in the lower left corner you see here. This truly was a tennis court. They were literally on either side of the tennis court, flailing away at each other for days in this particular site. So the fighting here was just amazingly intense. And even for several days of this kind of close combat, I find it hard to imagine your morale or your nerves are not shattered on either side. Just the intensity of this has to be enormous. Yes.
The earlier picture suggested artillery was an important component. It was so devastated. Were they really dragging artillery through there? Where it just could be mortar on its back.
No, both sides were literally dragging artillery. Now, the nice part for the Allies is that because they were much closer to their supply nodes and they had roads that they could use, they could tend to bring things up and do a little better job of it. But for the Japanese, they would use railroads to try to get as close as they could. And then a lot of it was done by animals. And I have a picture back a couple of lectures ago of a Japanese guy on an elephant. You use what you have. And if you need an elephant to pull an artillery piece, that'll work. Garrison Hill. This is another part of the Kohima battlefield, but it looks very reminiscent of Imphal. Just to give you an idea of the intensity of the fighting, the proximity to each other, the trench lines that are down here in the lower portion, the clearing of areas up on top, and holding the high ground here wasn't necessarily a good thing. But again, for the people who were there, life and death, this was every bit as intense as anything in any theater of war, anywhere, anytime. Once the Japanese are forced back, once they are no longer able to sustain themselves and they begin a somewhat precipitous retreat, over the period of a couple of months, particularly on the China-Burma border, where Stilwell had been making progress through March, April, May, he was able to continue driving the Japanese further south. And as he drove them further south, he could open up the connection. Remember that I talked about the importance of Michina. So up through here in this northern district, that's where Stilwell had started and was driving down. And the idea was to bring the Lido Road down so eventually they could connect up to the Burma Road. Right, here's the Burma-China border. But Chinese forces in the western part of China could now also begin to help. The Japanese were rocked back on their heels a bit. This is going to be a difficult time for them. And strategically, for the Japanese, there's nothing here that is of great value to them at this point. Once this area has fallen, and this is an open flank, if you don't deal with this, none of this matters. So the Chinese come in and begin to attack. And they begin to isolate or threaten to isolate these Japanese concentrations. And the Japanese now have to fall back. And the only place they can fall back is along this way. Here's the Salween River. So eventually, once these forces join up, you now have a consolidated force that can push down through this area. But again, logistics. Do you have any good road system here at all? No, you have tracks. What in the monsoon region? Deluge, mud, rivers swollen beyond their banks by far, literal raging torrents. How are you going to cross them? What support do you have to do that? And again, air power in China in terms of fighters or fighter bombers, remember, put aside the B-29s, is very limited, partly because the terrain is so awful. Secondly, the range is much further. It's hard to appreciate the distances that are involved here. But more importantly, how do you even see a target in the jungle, in this terrain? How do you even find them? That in itself is difficult. So all of these things play a role, and it's literally a forgotten theater of the war, but very intense, very, very difficult. This is sort of a global view, and the reason for showing this is to show the following. Up through here is where the Japanese had kind of reached the pinnacle of their advance. They weren't able to break this line and get through. They had driven up into the northern part of Burma on the eastern edge, but Stilwell had organized an offensive and driven down against them. And eventually the Japanese are pushed all the way back to here. So they've retreated this whole distance. This gives you a sense of distance down here. What does that accomplish? Not a whole lot. Yes, you can eventually open the Lido Road and you can get to the Burma Road and you can begin to transit overland supplies, but even then, that's a difficult journey. Has anything else been accomplished?
Cut off the food supply.
If you get far enough south, but remember, this is still Burma. So there's still all this that brings down food, right? So you haven't really gotten that. But what you've done is you forced the Japanese to make a decision. They thought if they were successful with their offensive, they might be able to hold the line further north and begin to shift forces away and use them defensively, but now they can't. Now the Allies are ascendant, and if they continue to drive down this open territory, eventually down to Rangoon, then you're in real trouble, as you just mentioned. Your food supply now is really threatened badly. So the Japanese are trying to hold on, but it's not looking good for them at this point. This is just a blow up of the detail and recover some of the information that I just talked over with you. The important part now is that the Lido Road is being linked up to the Burma Road through Michina, which is right here. Okay. You can begin to find your way across to here and bring supplies in from India. Okay. I use the word repetitsa in reference to the mud season in Russia, both in the spring and in the late fall. But this gives you an idea of the difficulties that you're going to face in this part of the world. And it's hard to imagine that you could make it. I just, at times I look at that picture and I think he's almost up to the bottom of his vehicle. And the guy behind him and the guy behind him is driving the ruts deeper. How do you not get stuck? And these vehicles, you know, the Jeeps and so on are relatively light compared to the trucks that you really need to bring them in. And then on top of it, you have this. I don't see any guardrails. And you think of the engineering feat to take it up to the pass. That's way up here somewhere, goes around the corner of that hill. And you think to yourself, first, a lot of this was built by hand. The second part is that it was pretty much a one-way street, though you could get an idea of this guy. If you pulled over far enough, maybe you could have somebody coming the other way. But if you pull over too far, that's all downhill.
Anytime.
But this is what was accomplished. This is what was built by these people under the most extraordinary circumstances. And it just baffles me to think that you put that much energy and effort into something. I mean, just look at the hairpin turn. He's up here.
That's tough.
Just, you had to cut that through, follow that ridge line all the way up. It's just amazing.
Very slowly.
Okay. We'll take a break and we're going to talk a bit about China. Again, because as we get to 1945, both of these theaters really fade into the background very, very deeply. And we'll focus on other ones. So take a break, enjoy. Now certainly answer any questions that anyone may have. Tom, was there anyone in Zoom land who wanted a question?
Nobody's.
Yeah, I think so.
Nobody's there?
No, so we got people there, but nobody. They're very quiet.
They're very quiet, okay.
I remember when Mandalay fell, that was a big deal.
Oh, absolutely, because it was an important hub that led you north into that relative plain. It was a communication center. And the Japanese needed to hold on to Mandalay if they were going to be able to use the resources in Burma. But they had to go from Mandalay down to Rangoon for them to be transported back across to Japan, where they could be used. So Rangoon was the key site in Burma, but Mandalay was the distribution center. Everything fanned out from there.
My cousin, when he fought in Burma, he was attached first at one point to the Madras sappers and miners,
Oh,
and at one point to the Gurkhas. I'm not quite sure which regiment. And we had to stay one time, two Australians who were headed for Burma. So Mr. Bourne and Mr. Beer. And when we got to Australia on sabbatical, I went to the War Memorial, because this was back in the, well, probably when 42, we had Mr. Bourne and Mr. Beer. So they had a long way to go. And I went to the War Memorial to see if I could find them, because they were, didn't have much chance of it. And at one point I wrote an article that I sent to one of the women's magazines in Australia while I was there, just before we left, saying, you know, telling about Mr. Vaughan and Mr. Beer and wondering what happened to them. And I got a letter eventually, many months later, from their commanding officer saying that they both survived, but had been in the big Qing something, a prison camp.
oh,
But they survived that too.
it's an amazing experience. The other part to remember, of course, and this is one of the things that both the Japanese and the Germans did to their own disadvantage, is the way they treated the indigenous populations. They basically were going to use slave labor, and relatively unimportant in and of themselves. Whereas if they had been a little more gracious, once they won, then they could do what they want. But they were fortunately too stupid to do that.
What was the Japanese, what did they hope to accomplish on this?
In terms of Burma or in
Yeah,
terms of the war?
Why did they
Catch it and use it.
Oh, food?
Food, yeah. The Burma was really the rice basket, an enormous production of rice, which was critical to Japan, because remember, the farmland in Japan was completely insufficient for their growing population, just as they had very limited natural resources of other sites. That's why Korea was important, why Manchuria was important, and eventually a bit of a stretch in their thinking was, if we can control the resources of China by controlling the coastal areas and using that population again to feed us. But yeah, this particular area, food. Yes,
I don't know if you're gonna talk about it, but in Indochina, you had the Vichy French. What was their activity?
in 1940, once Vichy France was created with the surrender of the nation of France and it split, the Japanese basically said to the Vichy government, we want to use that territory in Indochina. And you can either allow us to do it or we'll take it. So the Vichy French government said, well, okay, you can station troops there. Now, why did Japan want Indochina? Because they were planning to go further south and capture the oil resources in the Dutch region, Sumatra, Java, Borneo,
Which they
and
did.
so on. Yes, but they wanted that area what we call Vietnam, but it was also part of Laos and so on, in order to have airfields, which would allow them to help control the Philippines. Remember, that was another concern about sitting on the supply lines that the Japanese were going to rely on. but also allow them to support their amphibious landings that were gonna take place all along Malaya, cut off Singapore and so on.
So the French army and navy just sat idle?
Well, there wasn't any real French navy there. They had a few gunboats, but they were of no significance. They had no major fleets there at all. Their fleets have been basically kept, once the war was declared between France and Germany and Great Britain, they had brought nearly all of their capital ships back to France or North Africa. And that led to a great difficulty between the French and the British when the French government in June, I think it was, of 1940, and the British said, join us, bring your fleet over to us and we'll help keep these guys away. At the very least, send them to the Caribbean and let them just sit there, but don't leave them in Toulon, for example, which they did. Or in Iran or other places in North Africa where they're of no use to anybody. In fact, the British actually attacked the French Navy because of that.
We sucked it all.
I have to admit, I still don't understand why the French gave up the war. I just don't get it. It's an interesting set of issues.
Back to de Brugge. My grandparents were tea planters in the late 1800s, for 2 decades up there. And one of my cousins went back within the past 20, 30 years to de Brugge to see what it was like. And it's sort of like, yo. Several of my family are buried in de Brugge. And so I said, oh, go and get a photograph of the headstones. I think that's interesting. There was no Presbyterian burial ground anymore because a landslide had just got dreadful terrain. And it seems to me that down in Burma, in the northern part of Burma, there was a particularly helpful tribe. I wonder if they don't, I mean, people lived up there.
Right.
Didn't seem that they could, but they did. Tribes of them. And it was one tribe that was helpful. I read a book by a man who he was something the elephant man. He was a young man who'd gone out to join the I can't remember who it was, who used elephants for their purposes. And he had to get to know the elephants. And when the war came, he hid. Noticed that the Japanese used elephants indeed, but so did we. The Japanese were not very, the elephants tended to die. They tended to shoot them when they weren't any use anymore. But this man was describing how helpful the various, one particular tribe was, something Chen.
Well, it's an interesting element because now Burma is called what? Myanmar. And what are they dealing with there?
The terrorists, among other things.
Yes. So within, and it goes back a little bit to the things I've written on Substack, but it also is intrinsic to some of the things we talked about at the beginning. And that is that this sense of tribal identity is something that we all carry with us at one level or another. And it's a matter of whether a society can integrate that kind of identity in a fashion that allows the country to actually remain coherent and function. And as you're just pointing out, now in Burma, there's great difficulty. Remember that in Laos and Vietnam, the Montagnards had particular identity in an area that they considered, theirs. And they weren't about to share that with what they considered to be the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese weren't going to share with the Chinese, and so on and so forth. So this is human history.
No one wants to share.
Sharing is not a human trait.
Right, only up to a point.
Peace is not a human trait either.
As I tried to
You
point
go
out.
into the Valley of the Kings and In Egypt, you look at the walls and you see Ramses the whatever beating the bejesus out of the Nubians, you know, going back 3,000, 4,000 years.
Yep. Kurt, if you kill the front. We'll go on and deal with China in 44, because as I mentioned, there was enormous activity taking place. There had been this, of course, China and Japan have been at war since the 30s. 37 was more of a formality of war, but it had gone on even before that. And therefore, the Japanese had about 1 million troops in China, not an insignificant portion when you consider the size of the general population. They decided, again, in cooperation with Operation Yugo that we just finished talking about as far as Burma and the Indian border is concerned, another operation, and I don't know how you want to pronounce this, Ichigo, I guess would be the proper, because there should be a hyphen between the I and the G. And again, the Japanese had a particular strategic goal, I'll call it, in order to figure why you would put more resources into this. And the key issues are these. The bombing campaign was beginning to have an effect. It still wasn't as destructive as it would become through the latter part of 44 and into early 45. Something I dealt with in the last set of lectures that we covered on strategic bombing. But it nonetheless was an issue, because striking the homeland was something that you just didn't want to tolerate. Yet at the same time, you've been committing a lot of your fighter forces out in the Pacific perimeter, dealing not only with the encroachment that Nimitz was now bringing through the Central Pacific, but MacArthur coming up from the south. So you're committing a lot of your fighter forces there. And that means that the homeland may be relatively vulnerable, so you've got to shift fighters back in order to protect the homeland, and that means you have less up front. Remember, no resource is infinite, so you're always making choices and decisions about what's going to matter. So this was having an effect on morale. If our homeland's getting bombed, that's a bad thing. In addition, the logistics in China were still difficult. Now, as long as you hold the coast, which the Japanese did, it was a relatively easy thing. But if you had much of a difficulty in transporting soldiers from the south to the north or north to the south, you had to move them by ship. That just wasn't efficient. If you had a better way to do it, you could do it more rapidly. So part of the idea was to consolidate their holdings in Eastern China. And the way to do that was to drive from the north and the south in order to destroy the Chinese resistance and link together these various zones that previously were behaving more as enclaves. So that was another issue. The final issue was that, remember, this is before the Lido Road is open, so they're still flying over the hump, okay? The idea is, can we weaken Chiang enough that he will enter into some kind of negotiations, and we can begin to pull resources that are currently committed to China, because the Americans are beginning to encroach on us from the south and from the center. Right? So we have to keep this part of the perspective of what's gone on previously and how that shapes thinking going forward. So in this regard, the Chinese were going to make another major military offensive, distinctly different from Yugo, nonetheless had similar goals in mind, but here we need to be able to consolidate our territory in China. 4 distinct operations. This is just the way they do it. Notice that for this operation, the Japanese are going to put over 400,000 people together. So not a small force at all. And they're going to break the operation down in phases or different initiatives that are designed to keep the Chinese off balance and allow the consolidations to take place. Notice this, 400,000 troops, 12,000 trucks. We would land that many and more on day one in Normandy. Right? 70,000 horses. So in terms of mechanization, while this terrain was relatively okay for road work and things of that nature, the Japanese still relied heavily on horses, as did the Germans in the Eastern Front, as did the Russians in the Eastern Front, and on donkeys in Italy. You just can't get away from them. The Chinese general Tang Enbo had about 390,000, but the issue for the attacker is you're deciding the point of attack and you consolidate your forces to achieve local superiority, and that's what's happening here. So the first operation I've shown as a detail here, you see where Shanghai is on the East Coast. And this drive initially is quite successful in driving back the Chinese forces. You'll see where there are some airfields that are in the blue airplanes that you see here. And these are where not just Chinese fighters are, these are where the B-29s are. And notice that as you drive here, you're getting close. So the idea was to threaten, in part, these bases and force them to relocate further away from the front. Further to the south, and again, I've just taken that map and shifted it downward a bit. You begin to see that there are a number of different operations, but as they are successful, they have basically cut off all of the East China coast. And that has made, because there are no supplies coming in there from the Allies, because you can't get through the Japanese Navy that's there, or Air Forces. But the point is, this gives the Japanese much more control over shifting forces north and south. And one of the issues here, let's see if I can do this, Changsha here, was their fourth attempt to take it. It's finally successful. Now, I also have to say that my sister-in-law grew up in Changsha, and her family was there during the war and so on, and they displaced out. She wasn't born yet, but they were displaced out by the time the Japanese came. I visited Changsha, and interestingly, not too far from there is where Mao grew up. It was an interesting place. You can see that over the course of time, I want to show you down at the very bottom. Now, the Allied dead is not just soldiers, right? The Japanese were notorious for their treatment of civilians. So when they overran someplace, generally the inhabitants were not treated very well. But there's another reason for pointing this out. All right, I said this operation takes place, although you see January and February 45, over a period of about 4 months or so. 4 months. 4 months. How many did we lose through all of World War II in terms of dead? Not that number. Any less. And when I talked about the Eastern Front in earlier lectures, you'll remember that there was one pocket near Kiev that had 650,000 in it, of whom very few ever got home. So it's hard for us to understand and appreciate the depths of suffering that occurred. And even for the Japanese, 100,000 killed, and usually it's 3 times that number of wounded, some of whom will get back to service after a period of recovery, but a fair number won't either. So this is a brutal contest. Nothing nice or pleasant about this at all. This gives you just an idea of the kind of destruction that took place of the Japanese and Chinese soldiers fighting it out often at relatively close range, especially when you get in a city. And urban fighting is notoriously brutal and destructive. Now, what were the implications of this particular initiative? And what does that mean in terms of the rest of 1944 and 1945? The Allies continued to do what they're doing. The Chinese suffered the way the Chinese have always suffered in civil wars and outside attacks on their homeland from one place or another. The failures of the Japanese to accomplish much, although they did accomplish an Operation Ichigo to consolidate those areas, they had lost sufficient numbers of men and material that they were not quite fatally weakened, but they certainly were weakened, and there would be nothing more they could look forward to accomplish other than hang on in China at this particular time. Now, the Chinese were not gathering great strength, and there would be no major Chinese offensives that would take place other than some, when I use the word insignificant, I don't mean to trivialize it, but they had no major strategic implications by the Red Chinese Army or even Cheng's armies when they would engage in 45. The B-29 bases were abandoned, and they were done for two reasons. One was that we didn't know how close the Japanese were going to get to them because they looked like they were beginning to trounce the Chinese. And this thing you don't want is to let a B-29 fall into the hands of your opponent. This is the most advanced bomber that ever been constructed. And we just weren't going to take the risk. But also the logistic support for those bases was poor. It meant they had very little operational effect, at least in terms of number of aircraft flying and bomb loads they could carry. And as we were advancing in the Pacific in 44, we now were getting to where we would have bases that we could use from which we could launch these B-29s and attack the homeland of Japan. The Chinese forces maintained themselves, the Japanese population, right, because they weren't recruiting. So if you look at British Commonwealth, they had Australians, Indians, North Africans, anywhere they could find people who were part of their Commonwealth, Canada, New Zealand, they're all piling in. You have an enormous population on which you can draw. The Japanese, very limited use of indigenous forces. Bose was probably the most prominent, that I talk about with the independent Indian Army. But that was a limited force, and you had no way to really get reinforcements. So these are Japanese, and they're losing. And you can't replace them. Not very well at all. Okay, now we're going to get into the Pacific Theater, but I want to stop for just a moment again and give you the opportunity to ask questions or whatever. I won't cover all of the Pacific Theater in 20 minutes, as you could imagine. But I want to give you that chance to speak up or whatever. If somebody on Zoom has a question to ask away. Yes.
I've always wondered about the Japanese senior leadership and the quality thereof. And it might be easy for us to look back. I mean, as they say, history can be 20/20, hindsight. But it just seems to me that the leadership, I don't know if it was coming from the emperor or from the military commanders, but if we pull the camera way back, it seems like they were picking a fight with almost every nation on the planet, with the exception of Germany and Italy. That is a tall order for a relatively small island nation to even in their wildest dreams think that they could have been successful. Another way to state this is I would have loved to have been a bilingual fly on the wall during the discussions on whether or not we should attack Pearl Harbor.
Right.
There must have been an opposition element that said something to the effect like, look, even if we are successful in wiping out the fleet at Pearl, have you any idea what the industrial military complex strength of the US is? It's enormous. And they had diplomats here and they were driving in front of the Ford factories and, you know, they had a very good idea of our industrial capabilities. And yet they move forward. And maybe another way to think about this is, I'm curious on what the Japanese history books, the Japanese authors are saying or have said about that era in their history and their thinking during that time. Was it just blind hope, or did they have some kind of plan to be successful?
Yes, Robert.
Yamamoto, his own self said, I've got it covered for 6 months. And then I'm in real trouble.
There you go.
He was right. And when Yamamoto was killed in that raid, what was Bougainville he was
Yeah.
going into?
Mhm.
They probably lost their best strategic military person.
Right. Let me try to answer the questions.
It's a big question. I realize that.
It is, and to some extent, and Steve, I realize you haven't been here for, you know, the eternity that some of these other folks have dealt with.
It's a long punishment.
That's okay, I'm tough.
Just as a very quick synopsis, in the lectures on the interwar years, I don't even know if they're recorded, but they might be. And then the discussion that takes, the lectures that took place at the opening of the Pacific War, I would say set the following issues. And this is why I think we today can give some deep thought to where we are today and what kinds of experiences other nations have had who've made or been faced with similar choices. So here is a quick synopsis. The Japanese, once their perimeter culture was breached by the West and confronted Western technology for which they had no answer, they very quickly realized that we need to adapt and we better do it very quickly. As they did that, they realized the material they needed, not just the expertise, but the material they needed was not in the homeland. It had to be gotten from somewhere else. When you do that, that means you're dependent on trade. And that means you're dependent on the willingness of the nation with the resources to give them to you, to sell them to you, which means you also have to have something to sell back. There is a point in the Japanese history, and you have to remember the mindset of the Japanese from when the Americans showed up with these steel ships and threatened to bombard your forts if you don't allow them to land and, you know, establish trade relations. You begin to think, you know, if the other guy controls my resources, then he controls me. Now, where is that possible today? Well, where does the lithium come from? A lot of it comes from China. A lot of it comes from Africa. Okay. And our need for lithium to run our country is enormous.
There's been a major deposit found very recently in Utah.
Yes,
That transcends all the others put
if we're
together.
allowed to mine it. There's another issue involved there, but we won't go down that path. We're gonna let that lie. So
But
from
one
the
thing
standpoint,
too,
let me just finish here, all right? So also chip makers, now we're beginning to say, gee, we were relying on Taiwan for chips. And chips run everything. Well, suppose China says and is able to establish that Taiwan can't sell us chips. And what happens to us? What's the bargain? The Japanese were facing that. In the early 1900s, they have demonstrated their military superiority in their fight with the Russians in the Japanese-Russian War in 1905. Just crushed the Russians. And they basically said, listen, we're not only smart, we have a martial spirit that is well beyond these decadent white folk, because they were very intrinsically racist. And we just aren't going to allow ourselves to be told what to do. And then it escalated when they not only had Korea as a result of that particular conflict and other places they took over, but when they took Manchuria in the 30s. And the United States said, we don't like what you're doing, and if you don't behave yourselves, we're going to cut off imports. So the first thing was cut off steel, because the Japanese needed to import huge amounts of steel. And the Japanese said, screw you, we're not going to do that. We'll get resources out of Manchuria, we'll find iron, we'll do this and that. And then we said, oil. And they said, oops. Every place with oil is controlled by the British or the Dutch or the Americans. And if we allow them to cut us off, our economy just comes to a screeching halt. Our Navy is going to be totally worthless. And when they looked at it as they approached 41, they had 1 year of oil reserves left. 1 year. Now you think, again, just an example. We were the #1 oil producing country in the world back then. Okay. Now we still import for reasons that are a little bit unclear, and our strategic reserves have been cut down to about 1/3 of what they used to be. So if there's an interruption of oil imports to this country, it'll take time to gear up our production and get things working, and so on. Well, the Japanese were facing that, but with more dire consequences. So what's their option? Do what the West has told them to do? Get out of China, you can't do this anymore? Or screw you, I'm not doing it.
Could there be a middle of the road choice?
Well, you tell me what the middle of the road would be. That was offered. See,
It
that's
might
one of
be-
the things.
One middle of the road may have been, okay, rather than extend the war all the way up to the Aleutian Islands, clear down to Burma and everything in between, basically half the globe, if you want to, or maybe a third of the globe. All right, let's go into China and not think about just taking it or just attacking it, but yes, those two, but hold it as well. And then let the diplomats work things out and the lawyers, let them work things out, and meanwhile, we're gonna consolidate.
Right.
Or do that in Burma, if they were able, for their breadbasket, the rice bowl, as you were saying. But it just seems to me that they spread themselves so thin and wanted to do so much so quickly that the writing was on the wall. I mean, defeat was inevitable.
Well, I'm gonna postpone further discussion on that point because you and I could have that discussion for 2 hours. And I say that, quite honestly, but I want to go ahead and cover some of this ground before we come to the end of our 2 hours. At this particular point, I also, again, just want to reiterate, 41 Pearl Harbors attacked. We have a whole bunch of battleships that are severely damaged or sunk in Pearl Harbor, all of which, except the Arizona, are basically resurrected and will return to the war at some point. The aircraft carriers there were gone, thank goodness for that, and that left us some offensive capability, which we used to conduct raids, and that was in April of 42, the Doolittle raid. Then we had the major conflict in the Coral Sea. We lost the Lexington there. The Japanese lost one light carrier. I think it was the Shoho. That was May. And then in June, we had Midway with 4 Japanese fleet carriers going down. We lost the Yorktown. Then in August of 42, we invade Guadalcanal. That battle lasts until February of 43. And in the process, we're beginning to build up resources in Australia so that eventually we can not only hang on to New Guinea, doing by a thread at that point, but we're able to launch an offensive. And we talked about that in the last set of lectures. So eventually the conquest of New Guinea, the beginning to penetrate up the entire Solomon Island chain, Guadalcanal being at the lower southeast end, and we're working our way up to the north west end at Rugenville and other places. Talked about Vella Lavella and other spots along there where JFK lost BT-109, was eventually rescued and so on. And in the meantime, the last lecture on the Pacific campaign, I spent almost 2 hours talking about Tarawa in November of 43, the first major Central Pacific amphibious campaign against a heavily defended, relatively small island, which was a disaster in some ways, even though we took it eventually. But that was a shock to the American psyche. We hadn't really confronted that kind of issue before. For the first time, we actually had pictures of American dead floating on the waterfront, bouncing up against the beaches, bodies lying near the seawall, and so on. This, rather than demoralize us, galvanized us, and made us also realize something very significant about the fighting with the Japanese. We learned this on Guadalcanal. We learned it in Tarawa. They weren't going to give up. And no matter how badly injured they were perfectly willing to hold a grenade nearby, and if you came by to try to see if you could help them, they would blow you up as well as themselves. Suicide was perfectly preferable to being captured. So there are very few prisoners, and of the prisoners that were caught at Tarawa, most of them were Korean workers. Just as an example, they weren't indigenous Japanese. So the brutality that existed, depending upon what historical perspective you want, how you want to approach this, is that look at the conduct of the Americans fighting the Japanese and look at the conduct of the Americans fighting either the Italians or the Germans. And you'll see huge differences in why that happens. And that's not because of the color of your skin. Right? That has to do with how you fight, how you win, and what your expectations are if someone is surrendering or not. Okay. Now, Nimitz finally built up enough resources at Pearl Harbor that he was able to offer Admiral King and Roosevelt the opportunity to advance through the Central Pacific. MacArthur had been creating advances in the south from Australia into New Guinea, had basically begun to conquer all of New Guinea. He was beginning to encroach on an island called New Britain, at the eastern tip of which was a huge Japanese base called Rabaul. And Rabaul had enormous naval and air capacity, was very well defended. And MacArthur was beginning to look at other opportunities. And as is typical, in spite of the productivity of the United States, we had great controversy at home among our Joint Chiefs of Staff, trying to figure out who would get what resources. And there was great argument among all the branches as to how resources were going to be allocated. They weren't infinite, much as they were remarkable. They weren't infinite. And choices had to be made. Nimitz's prime theory was the drive across the Central Pacific means we're hitting relatively small, isolated islands. So as we go from one to the other, there's never a large terrain feature you have to beat. New Guinea is huge, right? If you look at a map and transport it over to the United States, you kind of go, wow, that thing is massive, right? Tarawa was, what, 300 acres?
Mhm.
I mean, come on, it's tiny by comparison.
Beto Island,
Betio, yep, it's actually pronounced Betio.
okay. 1 square mile in size.
Yeah.
It contained 4,800 Japanese defenders. It took 3 days for the Marines to overcome it. And 17 enemy were captured.
Yeah.
Out of the nearly 5,000, 200 Korean slave laborers were captured.
Most of the Japanese who were captured were out of it. I mean, they were incapable of anything. But to go on, so Nimitz is looking at this and saying, listen, I've got this massive Navy. We've been building this up. We have an enormous number of aircraft carriers. We've got air power like you wouldn't believe. And when they move across to the Marianas and other places that you see listed on this slide, we have the capability of really taking the fight directly to the Japanese and eventually to their homeland. Whereas this guy MacArthur is just coming up from the south and he's got all of this terrain that he has to deal with, these islands of very big sizes by comparison to what I have to deal with. And eventually, even if he gets through all that, he's got the Philippines that we already know MacArthur says, I gotta go back. What did he say when he left?
Return.
I shall return,
Yeah.
right? So he's got a political and a moral stake in going that way. But this is more efficient coming across the Central Pacific. Joint Chiefs have to make a decision. Roosevelt has to make a decision. He's the ultimate arbiter. And what is Roosevelt also dealing with? He's dealing with Italy. He's dealing with the plans to invade Normandy, which is going to happen in 1944. He's building up strategic air power in England. He's got to work out all the transportation issues, not that he himself has to do it. He has to decide all that. And he's got to do it in cooperation with Churchill. And Churchill is giving him all different kinds of information that his own senior generals are giving. And we'll talk about that a little more later on. So something has to be done. And the decision was, gee, if I can't satisfy one guy, I'll try to not satisfy either. So I'm not going to allocate all my resources to Nimitz. I'm going to give some to MacArthur, and neither will be happy, but neither will not be completely sad either. And ultimately, we'll try to make this work. And by attacking from 2 different directions, we also make the Japanese spread out and defend the perimeter. They can't afford to give up any of this particular area. And notice that it even spills over, as you see here. The Japanese can't ignore the threats anywhere on their perimeter. There's an old saying, he who defends everywhere defends nowhere. So we're trying to force them to make choices, and where they choose to defend most strongly, maybe we'll just bypass. MacArthur had already demonstrated the effectiveness of that when he was taking New Guinea. He didn't try to hit all of the Japanese bases along the north shore of New Guinea. He hopped around. He bypassed garrisons, cut them off, let them die where they are. And they literally would die because they couldn't get supplies, couldn't get food and things of that sort. So that principle was going to be offered. Now, the reason for this is just to give us a visual context of what constitutes the Central Pacific, because we tend to forget. And I just show this because I think it highlights it quite nicely. Flexibility was key in how we were going to set resources, but ultimately we were going to feed both major initiatives. This sets up what were the major strategic moves. And the reason for this being set up is not that you need to remember who's who and who's what. The idea behind it is that we're going to put in the boxes you see almost indicate the relative size of the units that are there, almost, not entirely, they're close. And the idea was that we would create a preponderance in the Central Pacific that could drive us close. What are we seeing here? The Philippines. And we're going to drive up this way. MacArthur's coming in this direction. But as we see this development, Nimitz is going to want to shift a little bit further north because Japan is up here and he wants more of that Central Pacific area that you see in this region. So even though early on we're going to be using a lot of resource here, this is going to come into play and we'll be beating back these major Japanese forces. And notice that the closer we get to the Philippines, the more isolated all of these are going to be. So there's another little trick. We can leave many of those Japanese forces in Indonesia and the places where they wanted to get the oil. We don't have to go there because the reason they're there is to get oil back to Japan. But if they can't get the oil back to Japan, they're of no value to anybody, right? Eventually they'll have to quit them. So again, a proper strategic analysis on the part of the Allies, and in particular, the Joint Chiefs and Roosevelt come to this. Now, a lot had happened in the early part of 44, but it was mostly under the initiative of MacArthur, which is why I showed that predominance of effort that you saw heading towards the Philippines. But as you move now more, and after the beating that was taken at Tarawa, the United States says, okay, if we're going to muster more in the Central Pacific, then we have to be prepared for the kind of intense fighting that is going to happen. And we're dealing with great logistical distances. So we have to have what's called a fleet train that will bring all the resources we need across the Central Pacific to fuel and feed these forces. All the munitions, literally food, water. You don't get a lot of water off these islands, right? All of that has to be run. All the munitions, all the replacements, all the spare parts, that all has to come from continental United States. Okay. Saipan was one of the first major places where the Central Pacific campaign was going to learn some important lessons. The landing on Saipan was not anywhere near as bad as it had been at Tarawa. The Japanese were defending at the beaches, but they were spread out more and they didn't have the time or the energy to create the defensive structure that you can do on an island as small as Tarawa. Remember that the commander of the Japanese forces on Tarawa said 1 million people, or was it, yeah, 1 million people can't take it in 100 years. And they took it in 3 days, kind of thing. But the point was, it was brutal. The battle for Saipan involves forces that are much, much larger than we had used previously in the Pacific. Now, we had used comparable sized forces in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. So the United States had experience, but those were army units, not marine units. The marine units were concentrated almost exclusively in the Pacific. And the nature of the fighting was a bit different. So the doctrines were a bit different. Now, people have said, and I've heard this a number of times and seen it elsewhere, why didn't the army in invading Normandy learn the lessons of Tarawa and the Marines and begin to act like they did with the lessons they learned? And that's because the lessons the Marines learned weren't applicable to the lessons that had been learned in North Africa and Sicily and Italy. The American troops and the British troops in the Western theater, as it will come to be called, had very different doctrines that were going to be used. Partly because the terrain was different, partly because their enemy was different. So it wasn't a matter that people weren't learning lessons. It was that the lessons could only be applied within the context of the situation in which you find yourself. I'm going to stop here because as we get into the Pacific issue, I want to be able to highlight some important elements that the United States was still learning as late as 1944. Okay. So I appreciate your tolerance. I, again, am grateful that you're willing to show up, and I hope that these are helpful in giving some clarity to literally where we are these days. Thank you.
You know, I started this at Keaton with
Oh, I started it, I don't think I did